Hello, good morning or good afternoon or good evening or good whatever time of night or day it happens to be wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News. I am your hostess, Liviana. I have often described myself as a progressive left libertarian. There are, of course, a number of people who can't seem to get it through their heads that the word libertarian has a history which predates the founding of the Libertarian Party in 1971. In fact, in most English-speaking countries, the word libertarian still refers to those who are opposed to authoritarianism and who support civil liberties. In America, unfortunately, we often have to qualify the term by saying something like left libertarian or civil libertarian when we do not wish to be associated with the Libertarian Party, which is a sort of neo-objectivist party based on the ideas of Ayn Rand. I am by no means interested in the ideas of Ayn Rand, and I will probably go into some significant criticism thereof in an upcoming post on my blog, which will, of course, be copied over to an article at the Progressive Flame, my publication on Medium. But as far as leftism, of course, what I mean when I speak of leftism is an economic perspective. To be precise, it falls somewhere between left social democracy, which is a centrist perspective, a sort of mixed economy, or Marxist socialism at the extreme left. There are a number of positions between those two, however, and the position which probably best characterizes my own is known as cooperative commonwealth eco-socialism, or just cooperative commonwealth socialism. And I have talked about this in the past and will undoubtedly talk about it again. However, it is the first word in the description, which I use for myself at times, that I wish to discuss in this particular video, that being the word progressive. I am a progressive left libertarian. So what exactly is a progressive? Well, I intend to discuss the history of the term, how it has changed over time, and the three distinct groups in American political discourse today who use the term to apply to themselves, because they are three different groups, and unfortunately this leads to a great deal of confusion. As such, I will be reading largely from an article I published recently in my Medium publication, The Progressive Flame. And I will also be adding a bit to it from elsewhere and just sort of riffing on what I said there. So therefore, let me begin to read from my article. This was originally published on my blog, and I do need to go back there and correct some typos. But on the Progressive Flame, it is those typos have already been addressed. So, without further ado, let me proceed. So the title of my article is "What is a Progressive?" And I will include a link to the original article in the video description if you would like to read it and see where I have gone off the script, so to speak. But anyway, let me begin. For the past 2.5 years, the term progressive has been rather frequently used in American political discourse. But what is a progressive exactly? This is a very good question because three very distinct groups currently apply the label to themselves in the United States, and an historical use also exists. What is this historical usage? What are the three groups currently claiming the title, and how do these three groups differ from one another? Beginning in the 1890s and continuing until at least 1917, although some historians argue that it extended to 1920 or even into the 1920s, the progressive era in the United States can best be characterized as a period of often populist efforts to promote reform. This reform was attempted in response to political corruption going back to at least the Boss Tweed leadership of Tammany Hall, as well as issues arising from industrialization and urbanization. What reform meant to any given person was a rather subjective matter, just as it remains today. As a result of this subjectivity, members of various political parties applied the label progressive to themselves or had it applied to them by others. The People's Party, also known as the Populist Party, was established in 1891 and was perhaps the first organized manifestation of the progressive movement, which would therefore trace its roots to the populist movement. The two movements did share at least one ideal, that of a more direct democratic system than was then in operation. They also did, at least some progressives shared an ideal which the populists had, which was to replace the gold standard on which currency was then based with a silver standard, which would make an easier money situation. So there would be more money in circulation because it wouldn't have to be backed by gold, but would instead be backed by the more common silver, and therefore would allow for greater employment. By 1896, most of the members of the People's Party had merged with the Democratic Party, although a few held out till 1908. Some Democrats and Republicans likewise embraced the progressive movement and name, and in 1912, a former Republican president, Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt, formed the Progressive Party, sometimes called the Bull Moose Party. By 1918, most members of this party had joined or returned to the Republican Party, with some joining the Democratic Party, and the Progressive Bull Moose Party was no more. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic president, had co-opted much of the platform of the Progressive Party for his 1916 re-election bid, and this, coupled with his slogan, "He kept us out of war," won him the election. He never attempted to implement any of the platform he had stolen from the progressives, and as we know from history, he didn't keep us out of war much longer. In addition to varying party affiliations, various ideological perspectives with their several agendas were associated, whether by self-identification or the view of outsiders, with the progressive movement. Social attitudes, which might today be called liberal, moderate, and conservative, were all associated with the label progressive. Some advocated for an end to tariffs and excise taxes in favor of a tax on corporate income. Others wanted to see this also extended to personal income. Some sought to have the gold standard on which the currency was based replaced by a silver standard, and to see the banks more regulated. Still others wanted the right to vote to be extended to women. Some pushed for prohibition of alcohol. Some called for modernization through technology and science. Some advocated for greater labor union activity. Foundations with charitable goals were established. Improved transportation and education were effected to benefit rural America. The so-called muckrakers were investigative journalists and novelists who exposed corruption, scandals, and waste in both government and the corporate world, leading to calls for various reforms in both sectors. Some even regarded Jim Crow laws and eugenics as somehow progressive, while African Americans set about working on their own progressive reforms involving better education, legal activism to secure equal rights, and assorted other things. Various other reforms were also encouraged. So as you can see, there were a variety of different perspectives and a variety of different goals which were associated with the progressive movement in the early period of progressivism in the United States. Now, progressivism, like what we now call liberalism, which is social liberalism, like conservatism, like all of these other social perspectives, does trace its origins back to the values established during the Enlightenment period. In fact, one could say that progressivism came out of classical liberalism, just as social liberalism would as well, just as conservatism had done also. So there is that history as well. In 1921, many of progressive goals had been achieved. For example, we now had direct election of representative senators, whereas in the past they were not directly elected. Senators especially were not directly elected by the people. And the progressive movement began to fade. Some regard the modernization and mechanization of industry in the 1920s to have been progressive, but at any rate, the wider reform movement had settled down, and the first stirrings of an economic laissez-faire attitude had begun. Policies and laws based on the economic aspects of what we now call classical liberalism were taken to unsustainable extremes, with trickle-down economics, deregulation of various industries, anti-labor efforts, a hard money approach to currency, leading to less currency in circulation and thus increasing unemployment. Risky lending by banks, which encouraged bubble economies, rampant speculation in the stock market, and so on, promoted by the very pro-business Republicans who were then in power, including Presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, who infamously preached rugged individualism as an anti-solidarity message. These laws and policies favoring big business and banking and seeking to restrict the efficacy of collective bargaining and the power of labor unions were among the main factors which resulted in the Great Depression. I have talked about this quite a lot in my videos and elsewhere for a while now, so I don't need to go into too much detail. In 1924, Robert M. La Follette Sr. had established a new progressive party which continued until 1934. His 1924 run for president was endorsed by the American Federation of Labor, that is, the AFL, which later merged with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, to form the AFL-CIO. His 1924, Robert M. La Follette Sr.'s 1924 run for president was endorsed by the American Federation of Labor and the Socialist Party of America. I believe this was the only time the Progressive Party of 1924 to 1934 actually ran a candidate for president. He didn't win. It goes without saying. Or we would have heard of him. Most people haven't. With the stock market crash and the dawn of the Great Depression in 1929, attention was shifted to economic concerns, as should be expected. President Hoover's efforts had failed to address the situation to anyone's satisfaction. Progressive Republican, or sort of liberal progressive Republican senators from western states urged him to take steps which might have had some effect, but his pro-business views led to him dismissing their calls and moving further to the economic right, exactly the direction he shouldn't have moved. In 1932, another Roosevelt was elected president on the Democratic ticket, and among his supporters were the same progressive Republican senators who had been ignored by Hoover, while other sort of conservative progressive Republicans opposed his platform. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He set about implementing the New Deal and espoused what could be regarded as progressive social attitudes. His vice president, John N. Garner, a Southern conservative Democrat, opposed many of FDR's policies and broke completely from the president in 1937. When FDR won re-election in 1940, he named Henry A. Wallace as his new vice president. Wallace had been a progressive Republican and didn't join the Democratic Party until 1936, having been appointed Secretary of Agriculture by FDR in 1933 and having supported the New Deal from its beginning. The Democratic National Convention in 1944 refused him the nomination for vice president and instead nominated Harry Truman. Franklin D. Roosevelt then named Wallace as Secretary of Commerce, in which position he continued through the rest of Franklin Roosevelt's life and into Truman's presidency until September of 1946, when Truman replaced him. Henry Wallace then became the editor of the New Republic. and criticized Truman's policies quite a lot as in that position. And in 1948, he formed yet another progressive party, running for president as the nominee thereof. It was sometime between 1946 and 1948 that what I call the modern progressive movement became a distinct perspective in American politics, and Henry Wallace and his Progressive Party of 1948 were part of this movement. His platform included national health insurance, welfare expansion, desegregation, nationalization of industry, an end to the Truman Doctrine and the Cold War, and conciliation with the Soviet Union. The Communist Party USA endorsed Wallace for president, and he refused to disavow their endorsement. In 1952, however, Wallace began to oppose communism and specifically what was being done in its name in the USSR, having learned of what life was like inside the Soviet Union from Gulag survivor Vladimir Petrov. Wallace also supported the re-election of Republican President Dwight D. Ike Eisenhower in 1956. The Republican Party platform of 1956 was surprisingly progressive even by today's standards, and certainly more progressive than the Democratic Party platform of 2016, in spite of claims that the 2016 Democratic platform was the most progressive platform ever in the history of the Democratic Party, which, even if that claim were true, would be a sad indictment of how far the Democrats have strayed from the platform of Franklin Roosevelt. For modern progressives, the meaning of progressive is largely intended to refer to an attitude toward change in society and requires support for reform and progress. The social liberals also arose around the same time as the modern progressives, that is, around the end of World War II, and are now generally called simply liberals, while the liberals of the past became known as classical liberals. Now, when we speak of liberals today, these social liberals, that term liberal, like progressive, like moderate, like radical, conservative, ultra-conservative, and reactionary, are terms which are properly reserved for attitudes toward social and or cultural change. They can also be applied to things like theology, with attitudes toward modernism and traditionalism. But we're not talking about that here, perhaps in some other video. However, progressive has also come to imply some economic views as well, modern progressives typically falling somewhere left of center on the economic scale, embracing either left social democracy or some form of socialism, while rejecting the extreme leftism of Marxist socialism. Now, social democracy, as I've said, is a centrist position, a sort of mixed economy, a little bit of capitalism, a little bit of socialism, and some types of social democracy are a little to the right of center and some are a little to the left. So modern progressives typically fall somewhere left of center, embracing either left social democracy or some form of socialism other than the extreme leftism of Marxist socialism. During the Vietnam War, modern progressives opposed the war, while social liberals supported it, most of the social liberals by that time having become Democrats, and the war being prosecuted by Democratic Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, as well as later by the Republican President Richard M. Nixon. Progressive grassroots activists helped secure the Democratic nomination for president in 1972 for George McGovern, who was, among other things, an anti-war and pro-ecology candidate. Following McGovern's defeat by Nixon in the 1972 election, a defeat assisted by some establishment Democrats, it should be pointed out, the Democratic Party in 1973 revised their charter and bylaws to prevent another grassroots progressive nomination like that of George McGovern, and also to avoid any grassroots reform of the party, to stack the deck against any grassroots takeover of the party, transforming the Democratic Party into a top-down organization, an anti-democratic organization, and ensuring that those who were in power in the party would be likely to retain their party positions. the Democratic Party has not nominated a single progressive for president since that time, although progressives have continued to vie for the nomination, notable examples being Dennis Kucinich in 2004 and 2008, and Bernie Sanders in 2016. Every attempt to reform the Democratic Party has failed, most such efforts having become co-opted by the party establishment. Following consistent wins by the Republicans throughout the 1980s, Democrats, beginning in 1989, started moving toward fiscally conservative, which is an interesting term that means economically right-wing, views. They started moving toward fiscally conservative or economically right-wing views, influenced by a guy by the name of Tony Coelho. This move to the right would be cemented during the presidency of William Jefferson Bill Clinton in the 90s, with the Democrats embracing neoliberalism, an extreme right-wing corporatist perspective which has been associated with the fascist dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, and which takes its name from the economic aspects of classical liberalism taken to extremes under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, as I have mentioned above. As a result of this, the Republicans began moving further to the right themselves in an effort to stay to the right of the Democrats on economic matters. Many Democrats who had previously called themselves liberal, that is, social liberal, also attempted to rebrand following the 1988 election due to the Republicans having done their best to turn the label into a smear and the Democrats being too spineless to defend their designation. These Democrats who started trying to rebrand after 1988 were doing so by co-opting the label progressive in spite of the history of conflict between modern progressives and social liberals, and without changing their views on social change. They still held to the same social liberal attitudes toward social change. As such, those liberals who still, whether consistently or occasionally, claim to be progressive are known by modern progressives as faux-gressives. They are Democratic Party loyalists. And during the presidency of Barack Obama, the Democrats would chase the Republicans by moving even further to the right, resulting in the Republicans again moving further to the right than the Democrats. And this has continued since. Both of the two main parties in the United States are now right authoritarian parties, and they keep moving further and further to the right. So this is one of the other groups. I've already listed the modern progressives, which is one of the three groups in America today which use the term progressive as a description of themselves. But there are these faux-gressives, the partisan Democrats who are still social liberals, who sometimes call themselves progressives. This is another group, and they differ from modern progressives in that they are, as I said, partisan Democrat loyalists. They are Democratic Party loyalists. They're not going to leave the Democratic Party. That's their party, and by hell they're going to stick to it. Blue no matter who. Blue, blue, blue. And modern progressives are not particularly partisan. We have been, progressive, as I've said from the history earlier, progressives have been members of all kinds of political parties, ranging from the Populist or People's Party to the various progressive parties, Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and so forth. So that's the chief difference between the faux-gressives and the modern progressives. There's also the difference in terms of the attitude toward social change, with progressives want reform. They want progress, whereas social liberals are more hesitant towards social change. They want incrementalism, as they're describing it nowadays, what they used to call in Martin Luther King's day gradualism. It's something that Dr. King condemned the Democratic Party for their gradualism. And we today have condemned the Democratic Party for their incrementalism. We don't have time to screw around with half-assed measures. We need to get to where we need to be now, and there's no reason we can't do it now. But, well, another difference is in the social liberal idea toward solutions to challenges. They sit in an ivory tower. They dream up what they imagine to be solutions to either real or imaginary challenges, and then they try to impose them from the top down, whereas modern progressives go to the people themselves who are affected by challenges and work with them to come up with grassroots solutions, which they then take up and take upward from the grassroots instead of imposing them from the ivory tower top down. Also, during the Obama presidency, a group which had previously perverted political correctness by embracing the worst aspects thereof, including a tendency to authoritarianism, intolerance of even the slightest dissent, and sometimes even of sincere questions, and self-righteous busybodyism, began to distort Kimberly Crenshaw's original iteration of the concept of intersectionality into a focus on identity politics, whereas Ms. Crenshaw had not been focused on identity politics in her original iteration of intersectionality, but rather on the structures which have historically contributed to oppression. Some of these people were also attempting to usurp the language of social justice advocates in an effort to spread their outrage and facilitate their promotion of a victim mentality. Now, social justice is a concept which goes back to the 1840s. It was originally formulated by a Roman Catholic, and it's very similar to the Protestant view of the social gospel. Again, for those of you who are familiar with Glenn Beck doesn't know what the hell he's talking about when he talks about the social gospel. If you want to know what the social gospel is, go read the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, and you'll know. The Sermon on the Mount is the central basis of the social gospel for the Protestants. But social justice was sort of a Catholic version of that. They're not identical, mind you. The social gospel of the Protestants and the social justice ideal of the Catholics, not exactly identical, but very close. And basically, what that means is the idea that the gospel has a social dimension, that it is not only a personal thing, but also that people should strive to improve the world around them by means of doing such things as Jesus enjoined in the Sermon on the Mount, like feeding the poor and giving clothing and housing and so forth to people who are in need. But anyway, these people, these what I call outrage mongers, some people refer to them as social justice warriors, and this was always a pejorative, in spite of some of them claiming otherwise. The term was actually coined as a sort of riff on the term keyboard warrior, because initially most of these people were just people on the internet who were pissed off about something. And so they were basically keyboard warriors, and they were talking about social justice, but they really didn't care about social justice. They were just using the language of social justice in an effort to promote their own particular I don't even know if it's worthy of the name ideology, but anyway, it's just outrage culture and victim mentality, victim playing, and so forth. And most of the outrage is outrage on behalf of other people. Some of whom, many of whom, are usually not themselves outraged and don't really see any point to being outraged. For example, you've seen a lot of talk about so-called cultural appropriation, which is a bullshit term made up by these people. It's a distortion of an actual legitimate term used in cultural anthropology, which is cultural misappropriation. But cultural misappropriation applies only to cultures which are endangered, and it applies to deep aspects of their culture, like their sacred tradition and so forth. Whereas these people, the outrage mongers, are raising hell about the superficial aspects of culture, like food and clothing and so forth. No one, you probably have seen some outrage over the young woman who wore a qipao, a Chinese traditional dress, to her prom. And these people just lost their shit over it for no reason. Whereas the people in China were like, it's no big deal. We like it, you know. We're not outraged. What these people in the United States, these outrage mongers, then proceed to try to explain to them why they should be outraged by it, and just can't get it through their heads that these people don't want to be outraged by it because there's nothing to be outraged about. So in a sense, it's kind of like white man's burden, that attitude back in the colonial days, that the more advanced, technologically advanced societies had a burden, which was to take technology and Christianity to all these poor benighted savages all over the world and force capitalism on them, and so forth and so on. But anyway, these people, these outrage mongers, gradually coalesced by 2012 into an apparently disorganized movement involving influences from Jacques Derrida's metaphysical nominalism, Michel Foucault's pessimism and dislike of the idea of objective truth, sex-negative and androphobic fringe elements of second-wave feminism, and the social liberalism of the Democratic Party, among other things. These outrage mongers inserted themselves into the Occupy movement and rendered it impotent by pushing identity politics to divide the movement into rival groups based on identity. Whereas at its inception, the Occupy movement had some success through an emphasis on solidarity. Everyone, regardless of their skin color, their ethnicity, their genetic heritage, their sexuality, any of these largely superficial differences, they all came together and stood together in solidarity against the 1%. But when these identity politics outrage mongers came on the scene, they divided everyone up into separate groups based on identity, and each group wanted to demand its own whatever, and then the entire Occupy movement became ineffective as a result of this. Now, there have been, as I've said before, some suggestions that this was not an entirely organic phenomenon, that there was some kind of astroturfing involved, and there have certainly been people who have suggested that the businesses themselves inserted these people into the Occupy movement in order to divide, because divide ut regnes is the age-old policy or strategy or tactic of the oligarchy, that is, to divide in order that you may rule. You can't actually be an effective force for change if you're not standing together and focused on that particular change, but instead divided up into separate groups, rival groups squabbling with each other over scraps, token scraps from the table of the 1%. Many of these outrage mongers also label themselves progressive. So this is the third group. Now, I've talked about the modern progressives who started in the late 40s and continue to this day. I've talked about the progressives, those social liberals who are Democratic Party loyalists, who attempted to rebrand and didn't change any of their viewpoints, and in fact are still actually social liberals. And now I'm talking about these outrage mongers, which are the third group. And this is third in chronology too, because the first group, the modern progressives, came into existence at around the end of World War II. The progressives came into existence after the 1980 election, and this group, the outrage mongers, came into existence around 2012. Many of these outrage mongers do label themselves progressive, but due to their focus on divisive identity politics and their intolerance and authoritarianism, modern progressives have come to regard them as regressives, a term which was probably first coined by people on the right or conservative or ultra-conservative types. However, it's a very accurate description. Because a lot of the things that these outrage mongers promote are actually going back, undoing some of the successes which have been accomplished by progressives in the past. So, for example, the desegregation. Now you've got outrage mongers, regressives, who say, no, we want to have segregation. No, we don't want segregation, kids, okay? Get over it. We don't want to have a race war. We averted it by means of desegregation. They talk about a scantily clad character in a video game and think that that's outrageous, that it's somehow fan service for male players. Not realizing that some of us who are female also play these games and like to dress nicely. And sometimes, if we're at the beach, we want to wear a bikini. Get over it. I don't want to be wearing something that women were wearing in the 1920s and 30s when I go to the beach. It doesn't look like it would be particularly comfortable, and I certainly couldn't get a tan. Not that I expose myself to the sun much anyway, but anyway, that's beside the point. A bikini is far more comfortable and looks better than the things that were worn by women in the 1920s. The miniskirt was, according to Nichelle Nichols, the original Lieutenant Uhura from the original series Star Trek back in the 60s, the miniskirt was a symbol of women's liberation. It's not an objectification thing. Most women dress for ourselves or for each other, not for men. I mean, sometimes we dress for men, but that's usually reserved for the bedroom. And, I don't need to go into any detail about that. But the thing is, these were all advances, that we no longer had to wear something like a burqa, that we no longer had to blush in shame if someone saw our ankle or our calf or our, heaven forbid, our knee, and it's also undoing this thing that second wave feminists fought long and hard for, which is to get rid of the notion that asking what was she wearing is in any way a valid question in a rape trial. Women have been raped wearing baggy sweat clothes, have been raped wearing flannel shirts, it doesn't matter what the woman is wearing, because rape is not about sex, it's about violence. But focusing on this scantily clad women in video games, that's giving the exact opposite message, that what a woman wears does excite male lust, and that's, again, not what rape is about. In fact, there's a passage in the book of James which says that every man sins when he submits to the lusts of his own heart, that it comes from within, not from without, that there's no temptation outside, but rather what a person has within. Now, I'm not advocating Christianity by any means. I'm very familiar with it because one of my 2 undergraduate majors was religion, biblical studies to be precise, and I did my graduate work in theology. And in both cases, these were Christian universities. But my views on religion have changed significantly since then. And perhaps someday I will discuss my current views on such matters in a video. But this is not the time for it, and I've kind of gotten off the topic now. At any rate, as I said, there are your 3 different groups. The modern progressives, who came into existence sometime between 46 and 48. 1946 and 1948, the progressives, who first started calling themselves progressive after the 1988 election, but are actually still social liberals and Democratic Party loyalists, and the regressives, or outrage mongers, who came into existence around 2012, maybe a little bit before, and sometimes call themselves progressives. But now let's continue with the discussion of the history. Bernard Bernie Sanders brought the name progressive back into the popular consciousness in his 2016 run for the Democratic Party nomination for president. With a long history of rejecting the partisan loyalty of the Democratic progressives, since he has been an independent most of his career, and rejecting the divisive identity politics of the regressives, indeed he has even explicitly pointed out that identity politics is divisive, Senator Sanders established his credentials as a modern progressive. Unfortunately, for reasons which remain unclear, upon being denied the Democratic nomination for president in 2016, he endorsed Hillary Clinton, who is in no way progressive. Now, there has been a lot of speculation about why he did this, but ultimately only he actually knows. And the only public statement I recall him making about it is that he was he wanted to stop Donald Trump from being elected, and he thought that Hillary Clinton was the best chance to do that. And that may be his motivation for doing it. I can't see into his mind or his heart, so I can't say. But there have been other theories, some of them involving an alleged agreement he signed whenever he filed to run for the nomination as a Democrat, and some of them being a little more, I don't really want to say paranoid, but yeah. Meanwhile, even as Democrats were telling progressives that they didn't need us to win the election in 2016, how'd that work out for you guys? It didn't work out too well, did it? But even as they were telling us that they didn't need us, modern progressives, David Cobb of Green Party candidate for President Jill Stein's campaign issued an invitation to progressives to come help build and own the Green Party, and several new progressive parties were formed, including the Progressive Party, the New Progressive Party, the Progressive Independent Party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party, and others. There were also, of course, groups organized like Democratic Socialists of America. And I think they might have been around before the 2016 election, but I'm not entirely sure. They certainly gained a lot of attention as a result of the of things which happened in 2016. Now, some of these parties have been influenced by regressives, while others may hold true to the modern progressive current. Some of them may have been influenced by progressives and are essentially fronts for the Democratic Party. How many of these parties will last until the next presidential election in 2020 remains to be seen, but the Green Party of the United States remains the progressive leftist party in the United States with the largest membership and the longest history, a history going back to 1980, as well as an established infrastructure and apparatus, members in public office, and experience getting on the ballot in spite of the numerous hurdles set by the two major parties. And our numbers are growing. Join us and help realize the ideals of modern progressives, which were born in the 1890s and entered adolescence in 1948, finally attaining adulthood in 2016 and slowly waking up to the pernicious deception of the two-party system in the 2 years which have passed since then. See the lies of the progressives for what they are, eschew the intolerance and authoritarianism of the regressives, and reject the bifurcation of the so-called two-party system. Join us and help reform the Democratic Federal Republic, which was established by the Constitution, and help save our earth from the depredations of those whose greed cannot be sustained, cannot be satisfied or sustained, frankly. So that is the end of my article. But as I said, there are some other things I wanted to talk about here. So, earlier today, a friend of mine, a Twitter friend of mine by the name of Helen Pluckrose, rather intelligent lady. I think she's a little younger than me. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, she had posted something about what she said was, I am unconvinced that Marxism is the right term for seeing society in terms of oppressor and oppressed groups and prioritizing this. People have done this long before Marx because groups have oppressed other groups. What matters is whether their perception is rooted in reality. Moses was not being a proto-Marxist when he mythically said, let my people go. The American Revolution was not a form of Marxism. Neither was the Peasants' Revolt or the abolition of slavery. Sometimes people see society in terms of oppressed and oppressor groups because it is. This is what matters. Is there a good reason to see society in this way? What evidence for it is there? I fear that associating claims of societal injustice with Marxism can often be a form of, you know who also liked dogs? Hitler. Okay, and so someone replied to her posts and suggested that you could call it neo-Marxism or conflict theory, but the point was that looking at all present and past socio-political issues through the lens of power and oppressor-oppressed groups, belief in dogmatic egalitarianism is a thing of the radical left. So in response to this person, I said, actually, no, it isn't. This focus on identity politics, outrage culture, and victim mentality is actually nothing but a series of obstacles to the attainment of any leftist goals. Leftism requires solidarity, and all this stuff you're talking about promotes division. And Helen is right. Marxists as well as other leftists, since we are not all Marxist, there being many types of socialism besides Marxist socialism, are concerned with class struggle, by which I mean economic class struggle. Economic class is not an identity, regardless of how much some revisionist takes on intersectionality have tried to make it so. When you focus on all these diverse skin colors and sexualities and so forth, all you're doing is promoting division based on what are largely superficial characteristics. But the poor black woman has more in common with the poor white man than either has in common with any member of the 1%. The working class, regardless of their various sexualities, have more in common with one another than they do with any useless bloated leech sitting at the top of the pyramid, getting fat off the lifeblood of the people. This is the only oppression worthy of any attention because until this is successfully dealt with, none of these divided up identity groups are going to ever have their needs and concerns dealt with in anything remotely akin to a permanent way. Identity politics is a distraction. It is perhaps even a tactic for perpetuating the status quo because it is naught but realization of the old oligarchic strategy, divide ut regnes, divide in order that you may rule. As long as we are divided into rival groups, squabbling over scraps from the table of the 1%, we cannot stand together in solidarity against the 1%. And so that person then suggested that I was committing a no true Scotsman fallacy. This is not a good thing to try with me, since logic is, something I know very well. It's a part of my field, and it's something that I focused in, actually. The focus of most undergraduate philosophy programs in the United States, at least, is on logic and the history of ideas, more specifically the history of philosophy. So, and of course, part of the history is what has sometimes been called contemporary analytic philosophy or 20th century analytic philosophy, which is all about logic and dialectic, by which I mean Socratic dialectic. It's about understanding and meaning and logic and truth. So I pointed out, no, it's not No True Scotsman. It is not No True Scotsman. It's the fact that words have actual meanings, and you don't just get to use them to mean anything you damned well please. Leftism is an economic perspective. It has nothing to do with superficial differences between people. You see, logic is actually my field, and as a philosopher I am interested not only in speculative philosophy but also analytic philosophy. The latter is concerned with language. Language in terms of semantics has been a concern of philosophy since at least the time of Socrates. It was also certainly the focus of much of what Wittgenstein wrote about in Übergewissheit in reference to what he called Sprachspiele. Put simply, no communication is possible if we are all using words in our own idiosyncratic ways. This is why we are encouraged to define terms at the beginning of discourse. It's why so much of Socrates' Elenchas is concerned with definitions. You cannot hold meaningful conversations if you don't understand how everyone involved in the dialogue is using the words employed in the dialogue. And you don't get to engage in semantic revisionism without explaining how you have redefined terms and why. Now, the terms left and right historically had different reference than they do now. As time has passed since the French Revolution, these terms have become more and more associated with economics. Identity politics has nothing to do with economics at all, and mostly it's people on the right and conservatives, ultra-conservatives and reactionaries who associate identity politics with the left, but these are the same people who claim that the Democratic Party in the US and New Labour in the UK are somehow the left, the ridiculousness of which ought to be blatantly obvious, since both are eaten up with neoliberal corporatism, and no leftist supports anything remotely akin to corporatism. Remember, one-dimensional single-line continua are not very useful when it comes to talking about any given person's perspective, because there are many dimensions which go into a person's perspective. This is why, for example, I distinguished between right-wing, which is an economic perspective, and conservative, ultra-conservative, and reactionary, which have to do with attitudes toward social change, toward change in society or culture or both. It is best to regard the identity politics crowd as what might be called limousine liberals in the United States. They are people in an ivory tower outraged on behalf of others, and they dream up what they imagine to be solutions to real or imagined challenges, which they then attempt to impose from the top down, usually through legislation, although sometimes through peer pressure and attempts to shame others. And then there's more and more as we continue to discuss this, but I'm repeating myself a little bit since I've said quite a bit of this already here in this video. But I did want to point out finally also in response to this guy, if you imagine that identity politics is somehow exclusive to a particular perspective and want to call that the left or the radical left, then how do you explain white identitarianism? These people even use the word identity in the names of many of their organizations, and this is not a recent term. So-called Christian identity, an Aryan and fundamentalist movement, and I use Aryan in quotation marks, goes back to the 80s. I remember because I was in university at the time when the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord got raided by the feds in Missouri, when most of us had no idea who they were and wanted to know what was going on. So we did research and found out about this whole white identitarian white identity nonsense, which was then, as it is still, a rather pro-capitalist and anti-leftist movement. That really shouldn't come as any surprise, though, since fascists in the 30s and 40s were known for, among other things, their intense pro-capitalism, even corporatism, and for arresting communists, socialists, and even labor union members. That happened in Germany, it happened in Italy, it happened in Spain. Mussolini even described fascism as corporatism, and of course their identitarianism is known all too well, but I suppose they were socialists because the word socialist appears in the name of their party in Germany. The Democratic Party in the United States rigged their own primary in 2016. I hardly think they are democratic, even though the word appears in the name of their party. North Korea is officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but I doubt anyone seriously believes that North Korea is remotely democratic. So again, a gaggle of identity politics-obsessed kids calling themselves leftists doesn't really hold a lot of water, and advocating for the correct use of the term while pointing out that they are not leftists, and explaining why they are not leftists, is by no means a no true Scotsman fallacy. You can try that on someone who doesn't know logic, but I do very well. And one more thing I wanted to to mention here in relation to this discussion, because it branched off into several different discussions. There was, oh yes, Helen had quoted me, had quoted my original response, where I said, actually, no, it isn't. This focus on identity politics, outrage culture, and victim mentality is actually nothing but a series of obstacles to the attainment of any leftist goals. Leftism requires solidarity, and all this stuff you're talking about promotes division. Now, she quoted me, tweet quoted me, and said, Giovanna, on the problem socialists, including Marxists, have with postmodernism, I am not even a socialist lefty, and my objections come from the liberal left rather than the radical left. But it is clear why radical economic lefties dislike postmodernism. So I had to clarify a little bit and say, I'm not a radical, though. I'm a progressive, and an actual progressive, not one of those regressives or faux-gressives who sometimes call themselves progressive. My economic view is properly called cooperative commonwealth socialism or cooperative commonwealth eco-socialism. And again, the difference between radical and progressive is something I discussed recently as well. Let me see if I can find that. That was a discussion on Google+. I had posted an article, and someone replied to it. So I should have found this before I started making the video, but I didn't think that I would. I mean, I didn't know that I would be talking about this, actually. So it's just yesterday or the day before, I think, is when I posted it. I know what I'm looking for, if I can scroll down to it here. And I gotta scroll through all the stuff I posted today and yesterday to get to it. Ah, here we go. This is it right here. Let me see if I can find which exact post it was. Yeah, here we go. So I had posted an article from TruthDig called Needed Now, a Real and Radical Left. And one of the people in the Progressive Fire community, of which I am the owner on Google+, said, no, not good idea to start civil war. That's what the world wants. And I replied, nobody's talking about a civil war. If that's what you got out of the article, I'd advise you to read it again. Organizing and establishing cooperatives to undermine the for-profit capitalist or corporatist system doesn't require any violence. The article maybe praises Marx a bit too much, which may be where you got the idea that it's advocating for some kind of literal revolution. There are two sides to Marx, though. One is his criticism of capitalism and late-stage capitalism, which is corporatism, and the other is his proposed alternative. His criticism of capitalism was entirely correct. His proposed solution was idealistic to the point of naivete and requires a literal violent revolution even to get started. But even in that, he also talked about cooperatives, and revolution is not required to establish such forms of business. We have them even now in the United States and have had for some time. I'm also not pushing for anything radical. Radical refers to dunamis, change for change's sake, and doing it right now without regard for consequences. That's one of the key points of difference between radicalism and progressivism. Progressives want change too, but we want change for the purpose of reform, not simply change no matter what that change may be or produce. So, I have no idea how long this is. Oh my goodness. I still don't. But I think I've been going on long enough now, so I'm going to go ahead and call this a video. If you have enjoyed this video and what I've talked about and so forth, please go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe, and press the bell icon next to the subscribe button to be notified of all new content. If you like what I do here on my YouTube channel and or at the Progressive Flame, my Medium publication, then please consider becoming my patron on Patreon. The link is in the video description. So Until next time, have fun, but stay safe. For Republic News, this is Liviana, signing off.